Dear, love you too. Thank you. I think it was a matter of not getting the building, the proper building. We had to wait our turn in order to.
You know what's funny about secrets? The harder you try to bury them, the more they scream to get out. And nobody knew this better than the Presley family in the hours after Elvis took his final breath on August 16, 1977. While the world mourned and fans gathered outside Graceland's gates, something absolutely frantic was happening behind those famous walls. Vernon Presley wasn't just dealing with funeral arrangements, he was orchestrating what would become one of the most elaborate cover-ups in entertainment history. See, there was this garage, not the one tourists see today with all those pretty pink Cadillacs lined up like museum pieces. No, this was a different garage, a private one, hidden away from the main estate, accessible only through a service road that most people didn't even know existed. And in the chaos of those first 48 hours after Elvis died, Vernon made a decision that would haunt the family for decades. He had that garage sealed. Not just locked, sealed. We're talking industrial-grade steel plates welded over the doors, concrete poured around the foundation, and a construction crew sworn to absolute secrecy. But here's where it gets really interesting. Lisa Marie was only 9 years old when her father died, but even she knew something wasn't right. Years later, as a teenager, she'd ask her grandfather Vernon about that sealed building. His face would go white and he'd change the subject so fast it made her head spin. "Some things are better left alone, honey," he'd tell her. "Your daddy wouldn't want anyone going in there." But Vernon died in 1979, taking whatever secrets he knew to his grave. That's when Priscilla took over, and let me tell you, she was even more paranoid about that garage than Vernon ever was. She hired private security specifically to watch that one building. She had motion sensors installed. She even planted thick hedges around it to block it from view. For years, the official story was simple. It was just storage, old furniture, maybe some equipment from Elvis's early recording days. Nothing interesting, nothing worth bothering with. But if it was really just storage, why did Priscilla spend tens of thousands of dollars every year maintaining security around an empty building? The first real crack in their story came in 1993, when Delta Mae Biggs, Elvis's aunt who lived at Graceland, was on her deathbed. She kept mumbling about the truth in the garage and how Lisa Marie needs to know. The nurses thought she was just delirious, but Priscilla knew better. She made sure Delta's final words never made it into any official records. Then came the financial pressure. By the late 1990s, the Presley estate was hemorrhaging money on legal fees, and the IRS was circling like vultures. They wanted to audit everything, and I mean everything. Every building, every storage unit, every square inch of Graceland. That's when Lisa Marie started getting desperate. She was now an adult and the full owner of her father's estate, but she was also facing potential bankruptcy. The government investigators were demanding access to every structure on the property for their tax assessment. Lisa Marie tried everything. She claimed the building was structurally unsafe. She said it contained hazardous materials that needed special handling. She even tried to argue it was a historic preservation issue. But the investigators weren't buying any of it. The breaking point came in 2003, during a particularly aggressive IRS audit. Federal agents showed up with court orders and cutting equipment. They weren't asking permission anymore. They were taking inventory of everything the estate owned, whether the family liked it or not. Lisa Marie made one final, desperate attempt to stop them. She offered to pay a massive penalty, essentially bribing the government to walk away. When that failed, she actually tried to have the building demolished in the middle of the night, claiming it was a safety hazard. But it was too late. The legal machinery was already in motion, and there was no stopping it now. What made this whole situation even more suspicious was how the family acted during those final weeks before the opening. Lisa Marie was seen at Graceland almost daily, pacing around that garage like a caged animal. Priscilla flew in from California and spent hours on the phone with lawyers, her voice getting more frantic with each call. The staff at Graceland later said they'd never seen the family so rattled. These were people who had dealt with decades of Elvis conspiracy theories, obsessive fans, and media attention. But this was different. This was terror, because they knew that once those doors opened, everything would change. The carefully crafted image they'd spent decades building was about to crumble, and there would be no way to put the pieces back together again. The question that kept everyone awake at night was simple. What could possibly be so damaging that the Presley family would risk everything to keep it hidden? October 15th, 2003, the day that changed everything. Lisa Marie hadn't slept in 3 days. She stood there in her pajamas and a hastily thrown-on coat, watching federal agents set up their equipment outside that sealed garage. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her coffee cup. The lead investigator, a no-nonsense IRS agent named Patricia Coleman, had seen plenty of wealthy families try to hide assets, but she'd never seen anyone fight this hard to keep a simple storage building closed. That told her everything she needed to know. "Ma'am, you can either step back voluntarily, or we can have the local sheriff escort you," Coleman told Lisa Marie. "But those doors are opening today. The cutting torch fired up at exactly 9:17 a.m. Sparks flew as the blade bit into steel that had been undisturbed for over 25 years. With each pass, Lisa Marie looked like she was going to be sick. Priscilla had flown in overnight and stood beside her daughter, both of them holding on to each other like they were facing a firing squad. When the first steel plate finally fell away with a thunderous crash, something unexpected happened. There was another barrier behind it. Not steel this time, but thick concrete blocks stacked floor to ceiling. Vernon hadn't just sealed this place. He turned it into a vault. "Jesus Christ," one of the federal agents muttered. "What the hell were they hiding in here?" It took another 2 hours to break through that concrete wall. But when they finally did, the first thing that hit everyone was the smell. Not decay or rot like you might expect from a sealed building. It was the smell of paper. Lots and lots of old paper. Agent Coleman stepped through the opening first, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. What she saw made her stop dead in her tracks. This wasn't a garage anymore. Someone had converted the entire space into what could only be described as a private office. There were filing cabinets everywhere, industrial-grade safes, boxes upon boxes of documents stacked from floor to ceiling, and in the center of it all, a massive desk covered in papers that looked like they'd been abandoned mid-sentence. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was the wall. The entire back wall of the garage was covered with what looked like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. Photos, newspaper clippings, maps, and documents were pinned up and connected with red string. Names and dates were scrawled in Elvis's unmistakable handwriting. Phone numbers, bank account information, business deals that were never supposed to see the light of day. Lisa Marie finally found her voice. "Please," she whispered to Agent Coleman, "you don't understand what this will do to people, to his fans, to his memory." But Coleman was already photographing everything, because what she was looking at wasn't just a collection of documents. It was evidence of a double life that Elvis had been living right up until his death. The filing cabinets contained contracts for business deals that had never been reported to the IRS, offshore bank accounts in names nobody recognized, real estate purchases in remote locations that weren't in any official records. There were letters from lawyers discussing legal strategies to hide assets, financial statements showing money movements that made no sense according to the estate's official books. And then, Agent Coleman found the safe behind Elvis's desk. It wasn't locked. Inside were handwritten journals, thousands of pages in Elvis's own writing, documenting meetings, phone calls, and business arrangements that painted a completely different picture of his final years. But the most shocking discovery was in the hidden compartment behind the wall of documents, a second room that had been completely concealed. Inside were boxes of correspondence with people who were supposedly strangers to Elvis, business partners who had never been publicly acknowledged, and most damning of all, detailed records of cash transactions that totaled in the millions of dollars. As the federal agents methodically cataloged each piece of evidence, Lisa Marie and Priscilla could only watch their family's carefully constructed narrative crumble in real time. Because what they'd found wasn't just evidence of hidden assets. It was proof that Elvis Presley had been living a completely secret life, one that would not only destroy his public image, but potentially implicate people who were still alive. The king of rock and roll, it turned out, had been keeping secrets that went far beyond music. What Agent Coleman discovered in those journals would have made Elvis's manager, Colonel Tom Parker, roll over in his grave, because the man who supposedly couldn't balance his own checkbook had actually been running a sophisticated financial empire that nobody knew existed. The first bombshell was in a journal entry, dated just 3 weeks before Elvis died. In his own handwriting, he detailed a meeting with offshore banking specialists in the Bahamas. Not a vacation, a business trip. Elvis had been systematically moving money out of the United States for years, creating a financial safety net that his own family didn't know about. But that was just the beginning. The deeper Agent Coleman dug, the more twisted this whole thing became. Because Elvis hadn't just been hiding money, he'd been hiding entire business relationships. Remember all those stories about Elvis being manipulated by Colonel Parker? About how naive and trusting he was? Complete fiction. The documents showed that Elvis had been secretly negotiating his own deals behind Parker's back since at least 1975. He had his own lawyers, his own agents, his own business managers that Parker never knew about. One contract, dated August 1976, showed Elvis purchasing a 40% stake in a Las Vegas casino through a shell company. Another revealed he'd been quietly buying up real estate across the South under assumed names. There were investment portfolios worth millions that had been generating income for years without anyone in his official circle knowing about it. But here's where it gets really dark. Mixed in with all these financial documents were personal letters that revealed why Elvis felt he needed to hide all this money in the first place. He was terrified, not of fans or fame, but of the people closest to him. In one particularly devastating journal entry from December 1976, Elvis wrote about discovering that someone in his inner circle had been skimming money from his accounts for years. He suspected multiple people, including family members, but he couldn't prove it. So instead of confronting them, he started building his secret financial empire as protection. The most shocking revelation came in a series of letters between Elvis and a private investigator named Marcus Webb. Elvis had hired Webb to investigate his own family and friends. The reports were brutal. Webb had documented systematic theft, embezzlement, and financial manipulation going back to the early 1970s. But Webb had uncovered something even worse. There were indications that some people in Elvis's circle weren't just stealing his money. They were actively working to keep him dependent and isolated so they could continue controlling his finances. The prescription drug problem that everyone blamed for his decline? According to Webb's investigation, certain people were actually encouraging it. In one letter, Webb warned Elvis that his life might be in danger if he tried to expose what they'd found. That letter was dated August 10, 1977, 6 days before Elvis died. Agent Coleman found Webb's final report, hidden in the back of the safe. It contained a list of names, bank account numbers, and detailed evidence of a conspiracy that went right to the heart of Elvis's inner circle. People who had been trusted with his life and career had been systematically destroying both for their own profit. The legal implications were staggering. If these documents were authentic, and all evidence suggested they were, it meant that Elvis's estate had been defrauded of millions of dollars. More importantly, it suggested that his death might not have been the accidental overdose everyone believed it was. But here's the truly explosive part. Some of the people named in Webb's investigation were still alive in 2003, still benefiting from Elvis's legacy, still involved with Graceland and the Presley estate. The revelation of these documents wouldn't just be embarrassing, it would be criminal. Lisa Marie's desperate attempts to keep the garage sealed suddenly made perfect sense. She wasn't just protecting her father's memory. She was protecting people who were still in her life, people she'd trusted, people who had been lying to her face for decades about what really happened to her father. Within hours of the discovery, lawyers for the Presley estate filed emergency motions to seal all the documents under attorney-client privilege. They claimed everything in that garage was protected by confidentiality agreements. But it was too late. Word had already leaked to the media, and once you open Pandora's box, there's no closing it again. The man who had been portrayed as a naive victim of manipulation had actually been a shrewd businessman who saw betrayal coming from miles away. The tragedy was that he'd run out of time to do anything about it. The first lawsuit was filed within 48 hours. Marcus Webb, the private investigator Elvis had hired all those years ago, was still alive in 2003. And when news of the garage discovery hit the media, he came forward with copies of everything, every report, every piece of evidence, every damning detail about the conspiracy Elvis had uncovered before his death. Webb's lawyer held a press conference that sent shockwaves through the entertainment industry. "My client has been sitting on this evidence for 26 years, respecting the confidentiality agreement he signed with Mr. Presley. But now that these documents are public record, he has a moral obligation to tell the truth about what really happened." The truth was uglier than anyone could have imagined. 3 people named in Webb's investigation were still receiving regular payments from Elvis Presley Enterprises. They had positions on the board. They had influence over business decisions, and according to the documents found in that garage, they had been stealing from Elvis since the mid-1970s. But the financial fraud was nothing compared to what came next. Webb revealed that in his final report to Elvis, he had recommended that Elvis fake his own death. Not because he wanted to disappear, but because Webb believed it was the only way to expose the conspiracy without getting killed in the process. The plan was for Elvis to stage his death, let the thieves reveal themselves by fighting over his estate, and then return with evidence to destroy them all. The problem was, Elvis died before he could put the plan into action. Whether that was coincidence or something more sinister became the subject of intense speculation. Lisa Marie's world collapsed overnight. People she had considered family, people she had trusted with her inheritance and her children's future, were suddenly under federal investigation. The Graceland Board of Directors was dissolved. Several longtime estate employees were arrested. But the real bombshell came when investigators started tracing the offshore accounts Elvis had established. They discovered that money was still flowing into those accounts. Royalties from his music, licensing deals, merchandising revenue. Millions of dollars that should have been part of his official estate had been quietly accumulating in secret accounts for over 25 years. The legal battle that followed was unprecedented. The IRS demanded back taxes on the hidden income. The estate's creditors claimed they had been defrauded. Elvis's surviving relatives filed competing claims for their share of the secret fortune, and the people named in Webb's investigation lawyered up and denied everything. Meanwhile, Elvis fans around the world were having their own crisis of faith. The man they had idolized for decades wasn't the naive, trusting soul they thought they knew. He was a calculating businessman who had been planning to expose his closest friends and family members as thieves and potentially worse. Some fans felt betrayed. Others felt vindicated, especially those who had always suspected there was more to Elvis's death than the official story. Online forums exploded with theories and speculation. Elvis impersonators didn't know what to do with this new information. How do you impersonate a man whose entire public persona was apparently a carefully constructed lie? The financial impact was staggering. Graceland's visitor numbers plummeted as fans struggled to reconcile this new image of Elvis with their memories. The estate's licensing deals were suspended, while lawyers fought over who actually owned what. The value of Elvis memorabilia crashed as collectors wondered if anything they owned was authentic. But perhaps the most devastating impact was on Lisa Marie herself. In media interviews, she admitted that discovering her father's secret life had destroyed her ability to trust anyone. "I spent my entire adult life believing certain people loved my family," she said. "Finding out they were stealing from us, that they might have contributed to my father's death, it changes everything." The investigation dragged on for years. Some of the accused died before they could be brought to trial. Others reached quiet settlements that kept the most damaging details out of public view. But the damage to Elvis's legacy was permanent. The king of rock and roll had been revealed as something far more complex and troubled than anyone imagined. He wasn't just a victim of fame and prescription drugs. He was a man who had discovered that his closest relationships were built on lies and greed, and who had been desperately trying to protect himself and his daughter from people who wanted to destroy them both. In the end, Elvis's greatest performance wasn't on any stage. It was the 20-year act of pretending to trust people who were betraying him every single day. What other secrets are hidden in celebrity estates? Which star's family is desperately covering up the truth right now? Drop your theories in the comments below, smash that like button if this story shocked you, and subscribe because we're just getting started exposing Hollywood's darkest secrets.